As a content creator in the knife community, I'm bombarded with a bunch of questions. Questions like, how good is this knife steel? Do you recommend this knife? And today I answer the question of, is it necessary? How's it going, everybody? I'm Rollshambo, the connoisseur and collector of all things sharp and shiny. And this piece of sharp and shiny is the Midgards messer, the Viking. Not Viking, the Viking. That's right. There can only be one Highlander, but there are at least 200 of these Vikings because they were made in a limited run. And sadly, by the time they sold out, you probably didn't even hear about it because it's a German knife company. Now, they've been making some noise. They've opened up their US distribution. Shout out to Mike from Midgards Messer USA, by the way, for sending this awesome knife and other awesome knives from their lineup for me to check out because it's just fun. And it breaks up the boredom of drop point, frame block, titanium, G10 micarta. Listen, this is a knife that is 100% necessary because we have so much of the same. Every day I see more knives and people say, why don't you check out this knife? Why don't you check out this knife? And you know why? You know why? Because I feel like I've already checked out those other knives. I don't feel like I've checked out this knife. And that's not to say that your Spyderco Delicate isn't a cool knife or that you don't deserve to see content on it. It just means that it's time for something new, something that hasn't been overdone, but has been overbuilt. Guys, let's go ahead and dive in deep on this Midgards messer, the Viking. And if you stick around to the end, I will tell you how you can get your hands on one. All right, guys, let's talk about this Midgards messer, the Viking. This is an awesome knife, and I'm going to get to why, but first, let's talk a little bit about the specs. We'll talk about the materials and the design, and then we'll talk about my thoughts on this knife. So first and foremost, you have CPM D2, which is different than regular D2 because it's the powder metallurgy form. And then you, of course, get titanium with blue accented hardware and also this purple backspacer and purple titanium pocket clip. The blade has this gigantic fuller, which I love. It's a weight reducing feature, and it also gives you something to flick out with your fingers. You see, this is supposed to be a one-handed opening knife to be in compliance with German laws. German knife laws are a little restrictive in that sense. That being said, you can do what I like to call the four-finger flick, like so. If you want a bit of a stiffer action, a more hydraulic action, you can, of course, open it with two hands, and you can tighten down that pivot. The pivot is working off of phosphor bronze washers, but it's hard to tell because the weight of the blade is such that it falls shut, unless, of course, you really crank down on that pivot. So the overall specs are as follows. You have a knife that is just over 9.5 inches. It's about 9.6 with about a 4.1 inch blade. It weighs in total, wait for it, 11.9 ounces. It's not a light knife. And if you're looking for something that you can carry around in your gym shorts, this probably isn't it. That being said, as far as the design is concerned, you get this beautiful frag pattern here on the handle scales and this Tonto harpoon-esque blade shape, which I actually really like. You do get a secondary grind there, but it doesn't look like it changes on the angle of the blade, such as many Tontos tend to do. Here on the back, you get a natural resting spot for your thumb, and you can, of course, choke up with your index finger. So you could get some nice controlled cuts in here. This isn't something that I would suggest for draw cuts. And, you know, with that being said, you might be thinking to yourself, why would I carry this knife? Because I did mention that you could carry this knife. Well, if we're going to do some comparisons, let me show you why you can carry this knife. So first and foremost, let's go ahead and put on the screen a Spyderco Paramilitary 2. As you can see, it dwarfs the Paramilitary 2. What about another overbuilt knife? This is the Strider AR-75, which is known for being a big boy, but it's still quite a lot smaller than the Viking. So we'll take it a step further and we'll go ahead and pull out another big boy, the Midgards Messer Thunrar. And the Thunrar, as you've seen, if you did watch my last video on this, which if you didn't, it will be in the corner. Feel free to pause this, watch that, and come back. The Thunrar is going to be about the same on the carry profile, maybe a little bit less, and quite a bit shorter. So as far as being carryable, let's talk about that for a second. These two knives weigh about the same, and trust me when I say you can carry the Thunrar. I know because I have. But let's talk about this thickness. The Thunrar is quite a bit thicker than the Viking. So this is going to be a little more carry friendly in that aspect, even though this is a longer knife. Now, many people will be saying, okay, so you can carry it, it'll be heavy, but I mean, big knives just don't have the greatest cutting geometry. To which I say, no, it goes a bit beyond that, because even though at the thickest part, this is about a 1/4 inch thick on the spine before the swedge, it does actually have really good cutting geometry, and it comes down to how thin it is behind the edge and how thin it stays all the way up till the first flat. You see, it's more than just how thick the blade stock is. The blade stock is nice and thick, which helps it retain rigidity as well as give it a nice, beefy, non-combustible type frame. But let's do some cutting tests real quick. You see, I had originally done a cutting test on a short for the Midgards Messer Thunrar, and someone said,
well, you know, it's just cutting like that because it's sharp.
Well, that's not necessarily true. It goes beyond that, and I'll show you what I mean. This is my fixed blade, my Sky Raider Knives Banshee, and as you can see, I've got a beautiful, beautiful polished edge on this knife. It is razor sharp. You could shave with this. All right, so this is obviously a piece of US Postal Service cardboard, something that you would use a knife to cut into. And keep in mind, the blade stock thickness on this guy is about the same as it is on the Viking. Just to give you a bit of a comparison, they're very similar, especially once you look at the widest part of the blade stock. Keep in mind, this has different cutting geometry than this, but this one also has a mirror polished edge, which should, in theory, because it's sharp, cut through it easier, right? Well, let's take a look at that, shall we? As you can see, it struggles, and a lot of that has to do with how wide it gets, how quickly. So, you know, that is a nice polished edge. It's very, very slicey, but when you compare it to this guy, which does not have a polished edge, it just has the regular factory edge, it's night and day. And a lot of that has to do with how thin it stays and the swedges here at the top, which keeps it thinner for longer so you have less to get cut up on. It's no contest, guys. You can definitely use this to slice through things. And so if you do decide to carry it and be a bit of a rebel like me, you can definitely cut with this. It's not just a hunk of metal, although it is heavy. Let's talk about the ergonomics real quick. The ergonomics on this are nice. If we get up nice and close, you'll see that the edges of that handle scale are really nicely rounded. And while it does give you finger grooves, and I'm not necessarily a huge fan of being told where to put my fingers, it makes sense. And even if you have really large hands, that pommel is nice as well. And I'm calling it a pommel even though it's not a separate piece because it's just kind of the shape. Speaking of the shape, you can of course choke up here for those more controlled cuts like I did mention. And so that's nice because of how rounded it is and how nicely finished everything is. Holding on to this actually feels really good. The thinner handle profile than the Thunrar makes this very comfortable, and I can see why this was a popular knife. I can see why this sold out. You know, as far as my thoughts on this, I really like this knife, and I think that while a lot of people would say, you know what, 9.6 inches overall length, I can't necessarily carry that every day. I hear you, but something that I noticed from carrying my Thunrar for a while, and keep in mind this is very, very close in weight and a bit thicker on the handle scale side. I carried this in my pocket for the last week. You can definitely carry it. Is it heavy at first? Sure. But the more you carry it, the less you feel the weight. It's just something that you get used to. And then I really enjoy having a bigger knife in my pocket. That just feels nice. And it's kind of the same thing with the Viking. So I'm a big fan of this. I can't wait to do my Grail or Garbage review on this, because I'm going to break down just about every category that I have to get to the skinny on this knife. Is it a Grail or is it garbage? We'll find out here in the next week or so, and I'll make sure to give it a fair score in the meantime. Big fan of this knife. Now, you might be saying, okay, that's great and all, but how do I get my hands on one? Because as you said, it's a limited production run. It says right here that this is 161 out of 200. They only made 200 of this specific model. Well, the good news is that they are coming back with a V2. One of the changes that I'm aware of is that they're going to be putting a lock screw here on the lock bar, similar to what you would see in the Midgards Messer Beowulf. Look at that, another one. That's right, we're gonna have more coming up. So you see that lock screw that will actually lock this lock bar in place so that you cannot move it, and it makes it more of a fixed blade. I'm not gonna call it a fixed blade because it's not, but that's just kind of the purpose. So it's nice because if you do decide to do some heavy cutting with this, you can have faith knowing that the lock bar will not fail with that in place. Overall, the aesthetics are beautiful, and it makes me kind of ashamed that we don't have more knives that dare to be different, that dare to go outside the lines of what's normal. And nothing about this knife is normal. The blade shape, even the way that the frag pattern is only on one handle scale. You know, that's just awesome to me, because the more different options we have, the more options we have. If everyone had the same knife, there would be no knife community. We wouldn't have room for opinion. And so knives like this that push the boundaries and the edges of what's normal and what's acceptable are necessary. Is this a practical knife? Of course not. But it's definitely a knife that you can carry. It's definitely a knife that you can use. It's something that's fun. And it's usable. Guys, if you think that this is too big, the good news is that with the V2 version, they're coming out with the little Viking, which is going to be a lot smaller. It'll still be a big knife in comparison to most knives, but it'll be a lot smaller than this and will definitely be even more carry friendly. So with all that being said, I'm a big fan of this knife. For all that it stands for and all that it means, I think that we need knives like this in the knife community, so we have those options, so we can express ourselves, so that if I want to carry a pocket sword, I can carry a pocket sword. Guys, that's all I got for you today. If you liked the video, make sure you give it a thumbs up. If you didn't like it, boo-hoo, there's a button for you too. And if you want to see more content just like it, make sure you hit subscribe. I'm Rollshambo. I'll see you on the flip side.